Welcome to the Wildlife Wire. I'm Mark Searles,
And I'm Samantha Miller.
and this is your source for wildlife news and the people that make it. Well, today we are diving into the mysterious and often misunderstood lives of bats, creatures that play a vital role in our ecosystems but rarely get the attention they deserve. From pollination to mosquito control, bats are unsung heroes of the night sky. So joining us today, Dr. Tanya Dewey, a wildlife biologist, educator, and bat expert with years of experience studying these fascinating mammals, both in Colorado and works abroad as well. She's worked at the intersection of research, conservation, and public education, and she brings a deep understanding to what makes bats so important and so vulnerable. We'll talk about threats bats face, from habitat loss to white nose syndrome, and how these animals interact with human communities and what we can all do to help protect them. Whether you're a lifelong bat fan or just bat curious, this conversation is for you. So welcome, Dr. Dewey.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate being invited onto your program.
Bats are a unique animal in that they kind of blend two worlds together, both the avian world and the mammal world, and have their unique niche as far as, obviously they're not related to birds, but have very similar characteristics in a lot of ways, wings being the main one. so tell me how you got involved with bats. Like, give me your background.
I can see you're going to be looking for all those opportunities.
You will. I'm sorry in advance for that, Dr. Dewey.
No, I love it. It's giving me ideas. When I talk about bats with students, I like to say that bats have all of the superpowers. So, flight is obviously one of them, which only has evolved 4 times in the entire history of the planet. And echolocation, obviously, but there's all kinds of other physiological adaptations they have that are really unique, not necessarily across all bats, but at least some bats have some really amazing um, adaptations that make them cool, and they have all the superpowers. Um, how I got into bats, I grew up really thinking that I was going to study whales. I love the ocean. I love whales. I love thinking about animal intelligence and the way that species that we don't have easy access to live their lives. The other thing that really has always driven me is a passion for conservation. So I, like many people, had an undergraduate course called mammalogy, so it was the study of mammals. And I remember when my instructor, who I'm still close to, was talking about bats, I just thought, wow, this is a way to make a contribution. And there's so little that we know about these cryptic species that don't live in the deep ocean, but they live, in all over the world, but at night, and do a really good job of evading our, sort of casual perception. And they're so important to ecosystems. So that's what really switched me from whales to bats, was just thinking that I could make a real contribution in terms of understanding them.
So, Dr. Dewey, you mentioned the superpower of echolocation. For our listeners who don't know what that superpower is, what is it?
Yeah. And it's funny because whales, at least toothed whales, also use echolocation. So some of my students pointed out recently that I've always been with the echolocating mammals. Echolocation is a way of perceiving the world that's auditory. So you basically put out an sound into the environment and then listen to the bounces, the sound waves that bounce back towards you from objects in the environment, and then your brain interprets them much the same way that we interpret light reflecting off of surfaces. So it's really just kind of like sight, but with auditory information instead.
And so, speaking of sight, so they have this superpower of echolocation. How good is their eyesight? Does it vary species to species?
It does vary species to species. There's actually a whole group of non-echolocating bats in the Old World. So they're found in Asia and Africa and up into Europe and in Australia. They're the Old World. They're sometimes called the Old World flying foxes or fruit bats. And they, for the most part, do not echolocate. So they have really excellent vision because they're flying kind of during low light conditions to find fruit. So they have a lot of great sense of smell as well. They have excellent eyesight. But it's true that all echolocating bats also have really good eyesight. So I actually was just so we're in the thick of the warm season here in Colorado. So I'm doing a lot of different things in terms of my research on bats. And it's always determined by kind of weather and moon phase. So my husband was asking, should we go out and try to catch bats at this particular site tomorrow night? And the moon is almost full and it's setting really late. So it's really, really light out. And that means that if I put up mist nets, which would normally catch bats if it's dark enough, they can see those nets and we're just not going to catch anything. So I said, it's not worth it.
That's so interesting. And you said old world bats. How different are bats around the world? Are there a ton of species? How diverse are they? I just think of one species of bat, but I know there's tiny, tiny ones and huge ones too. And some eat blood, some eat fruit. How different are all the bats?
Oh my gosh. There's so much to say about that because the bats are one of the most diverse groups of mammals in the world. So the most diverse group are rodents. That's over half of all mammal species on the planet are rodents. But about a quarter are bats. So that's a really substantial portion. It's changing all the time as we discover new species or learn more about the species that we think we know already. But there are between like 1,200 and 1,500 bat species on the planet. So it's quite a few. Lots of families. They've been evolving for about 60 million years. And they do all the things, right? So this is another one of the superpowers is that they really do, in terms of dietary ecology, do all of the different things. We have really small bats that eat insects. We have really large bats that rely on fruit. And we have these odd little critters like vampire bats that drink blood. They do. There are only 3 species, and only one of them actually ever sort of accidentally or just by virtue of the fact that humans are around will drink human blood. But there's all kinds of bats out there.
Oh man, my questions are piling up now. I do want to go back to the great eyesight echolocation. This may be a really dumb question. Can they turn on and off the echolocation? Like
that
how
does sound dumb, Mark. That was
it
a
does.
dumb
Well, what I'm
question.
saying, so if you're
I'm
seeing the
kidding.
world, you're seeing the world, and then you're also having this other ability to basically see the world. Do they complement each other when it's visible light, or
Yeah.
how does that work? It seems like a lot going on.
We're going to need a whole nother hour to talk about bats, I think. But it's really fascinating. So what you and I are doing is basically passive listening. So there are sound waves out there now.
Well, Sam is. I'm really focused on you.
Hey, whoa, whoa, whoa.
Well, you're actively listening, but you're also passively receiving those waves, those air waves, which are essentially sound. Bats have to actually exert energy or create that sound, basically either yell or sneeze, which we can come back to. Either yell or sneeze these sort of signals into the environment and then interpret the sounds that come back. So they use that. And they obviously use that when they kind of have to. It actually takes quite a bit of energy to do that kind of thing. So they're doing that when they have to, when they're actively hunting prey using echolocation, for example. They probably navigate to some extent with echolocation, but it's not very useful at long distances. So they're using sight. So they're using things like moon phase, and they're maybe even navigating by landscape features in order to move through the environment. So they're using all of their senses. They also use passive listening, just like we do. There's actually some species of bat that hunt prey only by listening to the sounds that the prey are making. So there's a species in Colorado and throughout the Western North America called pallid bats. Anthrozois is the genus, and they fly really low to the ground and basically just listen for things like scorpions and centipedes and large beetles. Because they'll make a little scratching noise as they're moving around in the environment, and they don't use echolocation at all under those circumstances. They just listen and then go grab the prey.
Wow. And is it known if they can differentiate the difference between a beetle and a scorpion? And like, are there some that focus primarily on one of those species or another?
I don't think we know, and that
Okay.
might be something that I say a lot because it remains true. The thing that kind of initially inspired me to pursue research on bats and make bats sort of, the curiosity that drives my life. Um, that it remains true that we just don't know a lot of really fundamental questions. So, for example, oftentimes let's say I've caught a bat and I'm showing it to somebody, a student or a member of the public or whomever, and they say, "Oh, where did they go in the winter, or where do they roost?" And I have to say, I have no clue. We have no idea.
And
But that's exciting
And
because
good job security too.
yeah, that is exciting. It's, some of those last great frontiers of things we cannot know or explore. I think that's incredible. I think the same's true of whales and marine life too. So you've certainly had a few similar threads in your interests and passions. I wanted to go back to some basics about bats. You mentioned them eating insects and scorpions, and there's only one that's ever will eat human blood. But beyond what they eat, what roles do bats play in the ecosystem?
Yeah, well, so it is very much tied to what they eat typically. So insectivores, depending on their size and therefore the size of the prey that they eat, the insect prey that they eat, can have a huge impact on things like agricultural pests or pests of forests. So they impact our production of timber, production of crops. There's actually, I'm not going to get the numbers exactly right, but there was a really great study a long time ago in agricultural areas in the Midwest, and they estimated, I believe, the regional economic impact of insectivorous bats as $13 billion. So just, and think about all these, like these really large roosts, these really large famous roosts of Mexican free-tailed bats, like at Bracken Cave or the bridge in Austin. There are millions and millions of bats, and they travel really long distances. And it's been documented that they spread out over these agricultural areas and eat agricultural pests. So they have a huge impact that way.
Wow. So that's a positive impact on
Positive.
agriculture. So they're free
Absolutely.
labor for the ag community.
Yes, yeah, they're free labor. In fact, California a long time ago actually started. They discovered that bats, especially these Mexican free-tailed bats, were roosting in bridges. So concrete bridges right at the juncture of those concrete, massive concrete pieces. It's a perfect size for like a little crevice for bats. And they found that they were roosting there and that they were having this really positive impact on local agriculture. And so they started just building bridges that way, just to create more roosts for bats. So it's been recognized for a long time, this really important positive impact. Other species of bats, there's some species that are just like hummingbirds. They're purely nectarivorous. They just drink nectar from flowers, and so they're really important in pollination. They might even have specific plants that rely on them for pollination. That's true both basically all over the world in the tropics. There are very few nectar-feeding bats that get very far into temperate regions just because we have winter and, it doesn't work out too well for them. Fruit-eating bats, and again, they're all over the world, but primarily in these sort of tropical or subtropical areas, are really, really important seed dispersers. So forest regeneration is reliant on bats often because of flight. So you can imagine, like, if you're a monkey and you eat a fruit, how far you might travel before that fruit leaves your digestive tract and then germinates in the soil. If you're a bat, in particular a large bat, you're going to fly a lot longer, a lot farther than that primate is likely to go before you deposit those seeds.
That's amazing. And so these different types of bats and their different foods that they eat, how many different species do we have in Colorado, and what do they tend to like to eat, or is it pretty mixed?
In Colorado, pretty much all of the species that we have rely on insects. And that's pretty much true of everywhere in the temperate world because there's just not enough fruit or flowers throughout the cold season to support populations of animals that rely on that. So insectivory is the primary way. It's also true that one really large family of bats, the Vespertilionidae, um, they're all, yeah, I can't think of an exception. They are all insectivorous, and they've developed some really special adaptations for hibernation. So it means that they can persist in extreme environments like we find in our mountains, for example, or in colder places like in Canada. So they have these really amazing, again, superpowers that make them really, really good at hibernating and surviving throughout cold winters until insects are abundant again.
So is that in that hibernation, is that being able to withstand colder body temperatures, or figuring out how to keep their body temperatures warmer?
Oh, it's actually becoming quite cold. So it's an interesting paradox. Hibernation is, we always think of surviving cold as staying warm. But if you really are a really successful strategy at surviving cold is actually letting yourself get cold because it reduces our very hot, very fast metabolism. So as long as you're metabolizing at this sort of, approximately 96 degrees, which is like 96, 97, like kind of an average mammalian body temperature, I should say degrees Fahrenheit, um, then you have to metabolize, like you have to eat, right? You have to fuel that system. So letting your body get cold actually means that your energy requirements go down a lot, like really, really substantially. And there's kind of two broad categories of hibernators. There are hibernators like bears, which actually only let their body temperature go down by like 10 degrees. So they're called shallow hibernators. Which is important for bears because they also have babies while they're hibernating, so they can't get too cold. But then there are the profound hibernators, and those are both bats and squirrels, so ground squirrels in particular, and they let their body temperatures get very close to freezing. They don't freeze because then you would have ice crystals that would disrupt your tissues, and they don't have antifreeze like some species of frogs. But they allow their bodies to get almost to freezing.
Amazing.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
We love it when we get really cool animal superpowers on here and hidden facts. I was thinking about amphibians and how they kind of freeze over winter, but to lower their body temperatures like that's incredible. Um, I wanted to pivot a bit to your research and see beyond how bats stay alive in the winter. What question are you passionate about answering with your research?
Like I said earlier, I've always been driven by conservation. So one of the first projects I took on was looking at, I basically did like a GIS project for my master's degree, which was um, looking at distributions of nectar feeding bats and thinking about like what are the biodiversity hotspots for those nectar feeding bats in South America in particular. Um, It was a really fun project. It was kind of thinking about like how do you plan sort of landscape level conservation efforts. But what I learned, which then propelled me into my PhD, was that we actually don't know that much about what the species are. So I was, using the literature and basically relying on the fact that we have these, this list of species that are nectarivorous. And I learned that there was actually, probably we didn't really know what the species were. So I, as a result, went on to a PhD and I chose a different group. I love the nectar feeders in South America, but at the time I had two very small children and I could not, envision taking them in for long field seasons in South America. So I chose a North American group, but that had a similar problem where there were these sort of, we call them nominal species, so sort of recognized in the literature, but a lot of controversy about what the species actually were. And then over the course of 5 years, it does take a long time. But you can see why. So every summer, because they're hibernating during the winter, I would go out, in my trusty Nissan Pathfinder and drive probably 15,000 miles in the summer from place to place, catching bats all across Western North America. So basically, all of Western North America, west of the Rockies, and including South Dakota, but I never got to Idaho or Montana, but everywhere else. So I went to I joke with students that it was an excuse for me to visit all of the mountain ranges of Western North America, but that's basically what I did and caught bats there of this particular group and used genetics to analyze their relationships, to look at for population level variation. And indeed, we found that there were what we call cryptic lineages, so cryptic species within some of the recognized species.
Fascinating. And you said that the bats that feed primarily on fruit are found in more tropical areas, warmer areas.
Mm-hmm.
As the climate is changing, has there been expansion and where they can live?
I would say it's very likely that that's going to happen. I'm not aware of any fruit eating bat examples, but I think there's some pretty good evidence. There are some nectar feeding bats that get into southwestern United States. So there's 3 species of nectar feeding bats that you can find if you go and put up a hummingbird feeder at night in like southern Arizona, southern New Mexico, and even southern California. And those do seem to be expanding their distributions. But it's all tied to the flowering of the plants themselves. So it depends on how climate change is impacting plants. And obviously, sometimes climate change means things like drought, stress, which may not actually be beneficial for those plants.
Interesting. Yeah, I was just picturing a bat at a hummingbird feeder and how mind-blowing that would be to look out out your window and see a bat there. I would imagine they would have to continue flying while trying to feed from something like that. Do they
They
always fly when they're
Yeah, they
feeding?
hover just like hummingbirds. They're actually, some people argue that bat flight is actually like, well, I hate this kind of comparison, but like better than bird flight because if you think about how a
You heard
bat's
it here
wing,
first. Bat flight is better than bird flight.
okay, we're gonna go all in on that.
Double down.
Birds have fused the bony elements of their arms essentially, and then they have these feathers which form the flight membrane. And so the feathers create like some maneuverability. But what bats have is basically the bones of their fingers extended with the skin in between it forms the flight membrane. And just the fact that bats can kind of create these interesting variations in terms of the camber of the wings, and there's just a lot of flexibility. So they're really good at hovering. Whereas a lot of birds are actually not good at hovering. There's only a couple of groups that have evolved that ability. So like hummingbirds.
As soon as you started talking about researching bats in South America and researching with little kids and figuring that all out, I need to know what is a memorable research or bat encounter that you had that you could share with our listeners?
Wow, I honestly have a hard time picking just one. That's one of the things that makes me feel very, privileged, very fortunate, is that I have, through the lens of bats, I've had the ability to have lots of different adventures. So I'm gonna pick two, if that's okay. So one that's kind of very bat nerdy, bat focused. Gosh, now I'm like wanting to choose a different one. Anyway, um, okay, I'm gonna go with what we did last year. So I have been studying a group of they're called Myotis bolans, or long-legged Myotis, in the mountains of Colorado, just outside of town. And I do this with students as part of a class that I teach. Um, and we put little radio tags on the bats, and we try to figure out where they are, where they're using, how they're using the environment, where they're roosting. And we're doing that particularly because we're catching a lot of pregnant and lactating females. So it seems to be um, a reproductively important or a site that's really important to their population and their persistence. So we were looking for this roost for 5 years. 5 years,
Wow.
I would put out tags with students. We would comb the landscape, which is obviously very complex in the mountains of Colorado. Um, and we finally found the roost last year. So that's huge. It was so mind blowing. And it's actually really a huge roost. It's, I think, the largest documented roost of this species ever recorded. So that's kind of exciting. And we're doing that right as white nose syndrome is arriving in Colorado and beginning to infect populations, so we can start to monitor this really important site. But I'm going to nerd out on this part of it, that it's a really difficult to access. So my husband is also a wildlife veterinarian and a bat biologist, and he actually did the radio telemetry. Like, he's the one that was like, I think it's up here. And so we hiked in, and it's really beautiful Forest Service land. Not too difficult initially, but the last maybe quarter to a half mile is literally like super steep bushwhacking, where you're like kind of army crawling under vegetation, and wondering where the heck you are because you have no line of sight to anything. Um, but we got there, and we got there just in time to watch the emergence. And I thought to myself, this is the first time in the entire history of humanity that anybody has watched this, because it's so hard to get there. And we
That's so
found
cool.
So cool. You're nerding out with nerds right now. It is totally, that is incredibly cool. That is so cool. And you just touched on this briefly on the white nose syndrome. And I know that's something that's really devastated bat populations. What is that, and how is it spreading?
Yeah. Well, white nose syndrome, we now know, actually, there was maybe a tiny microscopic bit of controversy about this, but just in the last few months, there was a paper published that confirms this conclusively, that white nose is a fungal disease that the spores of which were brought to the United States, to New York State in particular, by cavers. So cavers that had gone to Europe and came back with European cave dirt on their equipment, brought it into caves in New York State, and therefore, basically transported it's essentially an invasive pest or disease. So bats in Europe also, especially bats in the genus Myotis in Europe, do experience negative impacts of this fungus when they're hibernating, but they've been evolving with it for so long that they don't seem to die at the rates that we see in our own bats. Our species, our North American species of Myotis, have not been evolving with this fungal disease. And so what people started noticing, the reason that we realized what had happened, was that maybe even greater than 99% mortality in some really important hibernation roosts of Myotis bats. So just cave floors, mine floors, literally just covered with carcasses of bats, and huge population declines. And that's been the case for, I'm going to get the year wrong, but it's over 10 years now. And we've just been watching as this disease spreads westward across the United States and into Canada. And it's mostly spread by bats at this point, because as soon as you infect a population of bats, and then in the spring they disperse across the landscape, they're spreading the disease. But yeah, it's just arriving. It actually arrived in Colorado, and we have first evidence of infection in, I think, 2022. But that was at a particular site, and it has just been expanding across the Front Range since then.
And is there any way we could cave more responsibly or recreate carefully in bat habitat without disturbing bats, or is it best to stay out of bat caves?
Yeah, they're actually well in advance of the invasion of white nose syndrome in North America. There were substantial efforts led mostly by Bat Conservation International, which is a really important conservation group, but others as well, more local groups as well, to basically limit access to bat roosts. Because when bats are hibernating, you can imagine, we've already talked about the fact that they basically become like little popsicles, almost frozen. When they are disturbed, one of their superpowers is that bats can actually kind of wake up from hibernation, so to speak, although it's not sleeping, but it kind of become active really, really quickly. And they do that through a special adaptation they have where they just sort of squeeze blood that they're storing in their spleen into the rest of their body. And so they can kind of warm up, wake up, fly really quickly. But that costs them a lot of energy. So if you disturb bats when they're hibernating frequently enough, they just use too much energy and they can't survive the winter, which is what's actually happening with white nose as well. In contrast, so let me just close the circle on the whole profound hibernator thing. Ground squirrels, like if you can imagine a ground squirrel that also lets its body get really almost frozen, if you pull it out of its burrow in the winter, you actually it takes it like a half an hour or more to warm up. You have to squeeze it and, basically aggravate it until it warms up. Although they still have the same energetic challenge.
Incredible. The super heating spleen power is really cool. Since we kind of started going on hibernation again there, I did have two follow-up questions. One, are there any species that are less social and that don't hibernate in large colonies? And two, like the one that you found, is that something that they've probably been using for thousands of years, or what will it change? I imagine if there were certain environmental circumstances, they might have to abandon it, but do they prefer to be in the same spot year after year?
Yeah, that's both great questions. So I'll do the last one first. So yeah, it depends on the roost. So there are roosts that we have that it's easy to document have been used for a really, really long time. And those tend to be those more permanent roosts, maybe the places where bats will choose to be to hibernate, for example. A lot of bats roost during the warm season, so just like where they sleep during the day, in trees, maybe under a scaling bark of a tree. And that's going to change a lot. So maybe the tree falls down or maybe the bark falls off. So they're kind of constantly looking for roosts and may move among roosts unless they're females with babies, which, at a certain developmental stage, they leave them behind. And so they're going to come back to that roost. So there's a lot of variability, and there are a couple of species. So I think this is going back to your first question, that don't roost in groups. So bats are actually the most gregarious, so meaning social, living in social groups of all mammals. They're the most gregarious group. Most bats are social. Most bats live in groups, and some live in the largest known groups. So like Mexican free-tailed bats in the millions. There are a couple of species in Colorado and throughout the West that are actually social, or not, I'm sorry, not social. They're solitary. They roost alone basically on the surface of bark. And you can tell that because they are actually very well camouflaged. Like they're beautiful bats, but they're called the tree bats in the genus Lasurus. And they have they're very heavily furred. And they have this like one of them's called a hoary bat, so that looks a lot like bark, with kind of gray and white hairs. So yeah, they roost alone on trees. And they're also one of the only groups of bats that have twins instead of just one at a time.
Wow.
And you mentioned these huge social groups of bats. How do they take care of each other? Do they act as a larger family unit? Do they look out for each other? Do they share prey or communicate in specific ways? How do they work together?
Oh, it's another time that I get to say we don't know.
Oh,
We do know a little bit more about this than we used to. And there's actually some really interesting challenges. So if you think about, like, how do literally millions of individuals arrange or coordinate behavior to emerge from this roost on a daily basis, right? Like it's just an incredible feat of coordination. And if they're all echolocating, then how do their echolocation signals interact? You might imagine a lot of interference. So those are questions that are being researched right now to understand better how that happens. Um, Really large groups like that, they probably are made up of smaller groups, or we don't really know a whole lot about family structure in bats, with one exception, which is vampire bats. Vampire bats have actually been really well studied for this reason, or for this from this perspective. And vampire bats are really interesting, in some ways, potentially the most reviled species of all bats, because they do sometimes, this common vampire bat, Desmodus rotundus, they will bite humans and drink their blood. And bats, like all other mammals, like skunks and foxes and cats and dogs and etc., carry rabies. So if a bat has rabies and it bites a human, it can transmit that disease, which is fatal. So that's, really dangerous. But vampire bats are really, really intelligent, have really complex social structure, and we know that they take care of each other, that they feed each other. Like if one of them comes back to the roost hungry, their friends, not even their relatives, but their friends will regurgitate blood for them and keep them alive.
Wow. Nothing like regurgitated blood. Yeah. As you were talking about the social structures and like I was thinking of a cave and that has a large population of bats. I mean, it's just an incredible feat that they're even able to get out of the cave without mass pile-ups and chaos, right? I mean, to be able to just not continuously run into each other is wild. Yeah, just really, really amazing. And so,
They do this without any kind of air traffic control,
right?
or
Yeah. There's no guy with a little orange light out there telling you where to go. Yeah, just incredible. And speaking of like air traffic control, we're gonna have to wrap up here shortly, but some other challenges, like do they get affected by things like rodenticides or wind turbines, and urbanization? Is urbanization a benefit or a detractor for their abilities to thrive?
Yeah, we've talked about white nose syndrome posing a threat to North American bats. Before that, the most common, or the most important sort of threat to bats in North America in particular, but all around the world, is habitat fragmentation, habitat destruction. So definitely urbanization for the majority of species of bats is probably not, beneficial. It's detrimental. It takes away roost structures, it takes away prey. Just like any other kind of wildlife, it's kind of a common theme across wildlife, with some exceptions. So, for example, raccoons, think cities are great, and rats think cities are great. And so there are certain bats, like big brown bats, which are actually quite, they're kind of habitat generalists. They roost in almost anything. They'll eat pretty much anything. And you see they're the most common bat in cities or in urban or suburban areas. So they probably benefit to some extent, although I don't think anyone has really quantified that.
Like, do they have any challenges with rodenticides or with wind turbines. And then Sam, if you have any questions on what a big brown bat is, I can answer that for you, so we can talk offline about that.
Okay. Fine. But yes, I would love to know if they're impacted by different poisons on the landscape or power systems that we use.
Yeah. Well, I think pretty much any mammal can be impacted by rodenticide because it's literally an anticoagulant. So if you're exposed to it, yeah, it's really pretty lethal. But wind energy is an important one to talk about, especially with bats, because there's a lot of research going on this right now, but bats actually seem to some extent, or at least some species, be attracted to wind turbines. So it's possible that some of them or some designs are actually creating frequencies that draw bats in. And then they get close enough to the turbines, and when they get whacked, or even if they don't actually get physically impacted by the turbine, but they get impacted by the very high speed air that's right around the turbine, they die. So I tell a lot of my students are really interested in, like, how do I get a summer job doing something like this? And I'm like, well, it's pretty brutal, but there's a lot of opportunities to basically go out there and survey for dead bats and dead birds at wind turbines to just document mortality. And I was telling you guys earlier about tree bats, which roost alone and are really very beautiful, like hoary bats, and very migratory. So hoary bats, silver-haired bats, and a few other species are the most commonly impacted by wind turbines. They die at really large numbers. And, again, they're not rats. They can't have like 15 babies in a year. So when you have this sort of consistent mortality in a population like that, just not going to be able to recover very quickly, or maybe at all.
Well, all this talk of bat death is making me a little sad. I'm wondering, as individuals, what can we do to help bat conservation efforts, and what efforts are really making a difference for bats?
Good. Let's see. I think, you can be an advocate. I think that's probably the most powerful, most important way, is to just be aware of the things that bats need, like habitat that is healthy and continuous, healthy forms of agriculture, which of course also impact us, so reduced use of pesticides, and increasing reliance on the ecosystem services of wildlife like bats. So really just appreciating them. A lot of people like to put up bat houses, and that's another way that at least some species will be attracted to bat houses. But I think just being an advocate for wildlife broadly is going to impact bats as well. I think also bats got a little bit of or maybe even continue to get a little bit of a bad rap as viral reservoirs. So when COVID, beginning of COVID, there was this idea that it came from some species of bats in China. It did not come directly from those species. So just recognizing that every wildlife species has viruses. Bats are a little bit special as reservoirs for viruses, but just by interacting with a bat, you're not just going to automatically get sick, although you should always be aware of rabies.
That's a great way to end, and be a bat advocate, and try to minimize your direct contacts with the bats and appreciate them and be a good wildlife advocate. And we so appreciate you being on here today, and we hope to have you back. But until no, that was
I caught that one, Mark. It was too many bats. Go ahead. You may close out now.
But thank you, Dr. Dewey. It's been enlightening and a lot of fun going through these species that I just don't know much about, and I feel a little bit smarter now.
Thank you, Dr. Dewey.
It's been my pleasure. Yeah, I'm always happy to talk about bats, and we only just barely touched the surface. There's so much more.
This has been an episode of the Wildlife Wire with me, Mark Searles, and my co-host, Samantha Miller. Thank you for listening.